Angela, Chrissy, and Carrie. I'm making this video to you because there's some things that I want all three of you to know. I'm not making this expecting any response from you or reply to it because this is not something I want a response to from you. This is just something I want all three of you to know in your minds and in your hearts. I know that when you were little girls growing up during the 1980s, you were probably wondering, where is our dad at? I mean, gee, we only see our dad every couple of years. Where is he at? What is he doing? Why isn't he here? Why don't we see him? I don't really know exactly what you might have thought through them years, but I can only imagine with my mind right now. But you, all three of you went through those years, and so you have a better idea what you were thinking and feeling as little girls growing up during the 1980s than perhaps I do. But you know, you didn't really know where I was at, what I was doing, what I was up to, or anything else. That's what this video is all about. Because I'm going to bring you all the way through the 80s. I want you to know what the 1980s was like for me. And so, you know, I'm going to start with 1979, maybe November. But before I do, I just want to say that I technically left Burr Street in October 1978. And from October to November 1979, for about there were the divorce papers that went through, separation papers I should say, but it takes a whole year for divorce papers to go through, so they didn't really go through until about November 1979, as you see on the ones that I showed you on Facebook. But there had been a legal separation for a whole year before that, and during that whole year I spent most of that year fighting with your mom and fighting with Jerry about this, about that. I was really hurt, I was really angry, I was really mad. I didn't like being separated from my daughters, and I hated every second of it. And I was like a madman, ready to go off at any moment, at any time. And so, my mom was talking to me, and she was talking to my aunt and uncle in Sanford, that lived down in Sanford, Florida, that's really a suburb kind of Orlando, Florida. And they said, why don't you go down there for a while? And I thought, well, okay, I'll go down in Florida to be with my aunt and uncle. And the reason they wanted me to go down there is they were trying to keep me out of trouble, because I kept getting in this trouble with your mom, with Jerry, and the police were coming all the time, and it was just a mess. And I was, like I say, I was like a loose cannon ready to go off at any time. I did not take very kindly to being separated from my family, from my daughters, or having my cousin there with my wife and my daughters, especially when I knew there was drinking going on and everything else, and I never allowed booze in the house up until that point. So I went down to Sanford, Florida, and this was about November 1979, and that's when the divorce went through. Her attorney was, smart enough to have the divorce go through when I wasn't in St. Paul, and so that's what he did. But I want to explain to you how life went with me from that point, because I want you girls to understand something through this. And I'm not really making this video to talk about your mom and all that stuff. I really want to really share with you how I was feeling through the years, and that's what it's all about, to let you know how your dad was feeling through the 80s, year by year, month by month. But anyway, there I was, November 1979 in Sanford, Florida, and I couldn't stand it down there. You know why? Because all I could think of was my daughters. Every moment of the day, all I could think about is being separated from my daughters. I was way down in Florida, my daughters were way up in St. Paul, and I couldn't stand the thought of being separated from my daughters. Now I want you to consider those words that I just said to you. I couldn't stand being away from my daughters. I could not stand to be away from my daughters because those emotions, I could not stand to be away from my daughters, not only plagued me when I was in Florida, in Sanford, but they plagued me all the way through the 80s. I could not stand to be away from my daughters. If you want to know what I felt, if you want to know what my emotions were saying to me every day, throughout every day, from the time I got up till the time I went to bed, all my emotions could feel is I couldn't stand being separated from my daughters. So I decided to leave Sanford, Florida. And I started hitchhiking right out of Florida all the way across Georgia into Dalton, Georgia, where Grandma Pearl's from. And I stayed there for a few weeks with my grandmother until I could earn enough money to take a bus back to St. Paul. And when I decided, when I was in Florida, before I had gotten to Georgia, there I am hitchhiking in Florida, right about just a little bit south of the Georgia state line in Florida. I'm on the highway and I'm thinking, I'm going to go back to St. Paul and I'm going to make something out of myself for my daughters. It's exactly what I was thinking. About 3 miles on the other side of the Georgia line in Florida. And when I managed to hitchhike into Dalton, which is at the northern part of Georgia, I couldn't wait till I got back to St. Paul so I could make something out of my life for my daughters. And so I ended up back in St. Paul by the end of November 1979. And immediately I rode back into a business college. And while I was at that business college, just a couple days there, I noticed a sign on the bulletin board there of an employer advertising for an employee, and so I answered the ad, and they hired me. It was the company I went to apply at was called Hiawatha Metalcraft. It was down in southeast Minneapolis, right off of Franklin Avenue. And they hired me as an accounting clerk. And here's where their words to me. They had me sign a contract to this and everything. I had to sign a contract with that company. It was called Hiawatha Metalcraft. They said, we're going to start you out as an accounting clerk. You're going to business college. You're going to have a degree in 3 years, a business degree. In that 3 years, we're going to train you to run 2 plants. You see, the guy telling me that his name was Harold, and Harold was the office manager and controller of 2 plants. He was 59 years old at the time, but he was going to retire in 6 years when he was 65, and they were going to train me in that 6 years to replace him. They were going to start me out as an accounting clerk, where I did the payroll and all kinds of and I did the everything to do with employees, their income tax checks, right to the point when I handed it to the president of the company to sign their payroll checks. But they were going to train me to do Harold's job, to take over and be controller of 2 plants. But they wanted me to be degreed by the time I would replace him. And so they made me sign a contract that if I would stay in college, that the only reason they were hiring me, that my job was based on the fact that I would stay in college for the next 3 years and have a degree. That was the conditions. They made me sign a contract to that effect, that we're only hiring him on the basis that he will stay in college. Well, I was making something, trying to make something out of myself and my daughters. I was paying my child support payments just fine. I was making money on that job, and I was paying child support, but the school itself was costing me about $200 a month. It costed about $600 a quarter at that time, so that averaged out about $200 a month, and I was paying for the school out of my own pocket. I was paying my child support, and what little money I had left, I rented out a small room, a sleeping room, and that's how I survived. I survived in the sleeping room, working a full-time job as an accounting clerk, and then going to full-time business college at night. So I was going to working a full-time job and going to full-time business college at night. And I wanted to study accounting, of course. Well, the child collections, they got a hold of this, And here's what they said to me. They said, well, if you're paying $200 a month to go to school, you can pay $200 more a month for child support. And you see, I was already making child support payments. But now they wanted the money I was paying for the school to add on to that. You see, here was the thing. Up until let me explain, and I'm not saying this against your mom. If your mom was alive, she'd say the same thing. Your mom and I had this conversation about all this back then. But when I was living with your mom on Burr Street, I was working sometimes 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, making a lot of overtime. I was taking care of the family fine, but your mom wanted a divorce. And she went to AFDC and she says, will you help support me so I can, separate from my husband? Sorry, we can't do that. As long as he's still living in a house, we can't help you because of the money he's making. And so they said, you're going to have to get a legal separation, get him out of the house, then we can help you. And so that's what she did. She got a legal separation, she got me out of the house, and then AFDC started taking care of her for the next 3 years. And so now we're up to the point, it's 2 or 3 years later, and I'm working for Hiawatha Metalcraft, making that money and going to full-time business college. And Child Collections is saying to me, if you can afford $200 to go to business college and a month, they say you can afford $200 more a month for child support. And really, they didn't care about your mom. They weren't planning on taking $200 from me and giving it to your mom. They were wanting to reimburse Child Collections for all the money they had been sending your mom for 3 years. They just wanted to reimburse welfare. They wanted to get welfare $200 a month more. And I told them, I says, if you take that $200 a month, I says, I won't be able to go to business college because I won't be able to afford it. I says, not only that, but if I can't go to business college, I says, my job will end because I signed a contract. I was only hired under the condition that I would continue going to college for the next 3 years. I says, so if you take my college money, it means I can't go to college. And if I can't go to college, it means that I don't have a job. I said, why don't you just leave me alone for 3 years? And I said, I'll tell you what, in 3 years, I says, I'll be worth $50,000 or $60,000 a year because I will have a degree. And at this job, Hiawatha Metalcraft, I will be making close to $50,000, $60,000 a year because they're training me to replace the controller of 2 plants right now. And he says, when I'm making that $50,000 or $60,000 a year, I will gladly give you $20,000 just like that. I says, I'll give you half of it. In fact, you can have $30,000 of it. Just leave me alone for 3 years. And you know what they said? Sorry, we can't do that. We can't do that, Mr. Gerling. If you're paying that $200 for business college, we got to come after it. Then that means you can be reimbursing Child Collections. And to make a long story short, that's exactly what they proceeded to do. To make a long story short, the college went down the tube. And when that went down the tube, the job went down the tube. Like I say, it was under contract. The minute I couldn't go to school, the job was over. And I ended up a month or 2 later unemployed. And your mother was furious, but not at me. Your mother was furious at the system. That's when your mother decided to go back to work for the telephone company. That's what made her go back to the work for the telephone company. Do you understand? The only problem with it was too late. The school was gone, the job was gone, and I was living out in the street someplace because I couldn't even afford my sleeping room then. You understand? That's the way it was. That's the way it was. You see, your mom had lived on AFDC from 1978 until that's 3 years. You add up 3 years of AFDC payments. That's what they came after my checks for all the way through the 80s. Then after that job, I eventually went to work for Minnie Gaskell in downtown Minneapolis. I worked there for about 3 years. And when I worked at Minnie Gaskell, let me explain something, because I want my daughters to know how I was feeling. Eventually, I'm going to get to my emotions about my daughters through these years. I just want to explain the financial end of it for a minute here, for just a few more minutes here. While I was working for Minnie Gaskell, I was making about $7 an hour. That was pretty good money back then. I know it doesn't compete with the $10, $20 an hour they pay people these days, but back then $7 an hour wasn't bad money, and that added up about $280 a week times 4. A little over $1,000 a month. But by the time they took out for federal and state income taxes, I took home about $700 a month. But out of that $700, here comes child collection, taking half of that to reimburse for when your mom was on AFDC those 3 years. They're still coming back out of that money. Every check, they would take half the check. And so I would be left with about $350 to live on every month. And out of $350 a month, I had to get a sleeping room to stay in. Angela, you're listening? You came to one of my little efficiency apartments in downtown Minneapolis once when you were about 9 years old. And that little efficiency apartment was the best I could afford because, even though I was working a full-time job at the time, I could only keep half of my checks. And your mom wasn't receiving anything because the money they took from my checks, they weren't sending to your mom. They were sending to reimburse child support or welfare. For those 3 years, your mom was getting AFDC from the welfare. They were still collecting for welfare. And that's what it was like. Quite honestly, I couldn't afford a decent place to bring my daughters to. My daughters are sitting there over and bursting. Where's Dad? Where's Dad? Well, your dad was probably in some sleeping room that wasn't adequate enough to bring his little girls to. Your dad was extremely depressed about it. Now we're going to get into your emotions. What was it like for your dad during the 80s? Remember, I hitchhiked out of Florida because I couldn't stand being separated from my daughters. And that didn't change. When I worked for Minnie Gaskell, I couldn't stand being separated from my daughters. But every once in a while during the 80s, I might end up in a relationship with some woman. And in the beginning, like in 1979, I was with Carol, the first Carol, not the Carol I'm with now, but another Carol back then. And she had a pretty decent apartment. And so when I was staying and living with Carol, I always brought my girls over to Carol's house. I used to have pictures of when we went out and fed ducks with the twins feeding some ducks over there once. And so whenever I had a decent apartment to live in, I always came and got my girls. It never failed. Later on in the 80s, I ended up with Joanne on East St. Paul over by Johnson Parkway, who had a decent apartment, and I came and got Angela. And until Joanne killed herself, and then I couldn't. But I can show you pictures of when I was with Angela and Joanne. But you see, most of the time during the 80s, I wasn't with a woman. I didn't live with women's apartments. I lived in sleeping rooms because I couldn't afford anymore. And know this, I didn't create that situation. Because let's back up to 1978 when I was still on Burr Street. Like I say, I worked sometimes 6 days a week and sometimes 12-hour days. I worked a lot of overtime. I was supporting my family on Burr Street. And if it would have stayed that way, and your mom wouldn't have filed for divorce, And if I would have continued to live on Burr Street, then all my checks would have continued to come in Burr Street. And then if your mom would eventually went back to work, then her checks would have came onto Burr Street. And if both of us could have been working all them next 17, 18 years, imagine what your mom and I could have accumulated to help our girls later on. But no, your mom went through divorce, and when your mom filed for that divorce, your mom created that financial situation. Your mom's the one that went on AFDC for 3 years. It was because of what your mom did they kept coming after my checks during the 80s. It was them taking half my checks away was a result of the decisions your mom did. Not what I did. I didn't choose that situation. I didn't create that situation. But I ended up in that financial situation because of the choices your mom made. Because of the divorce that she filed for. And all I could afford was a sleeping room, which was those sleeping rooms were not proper facilities to bring little girls to visit. So I couldn't bring you to where I lived. Well, okay, I tried bringing Angela to my mother's house on Burnquist once, and while she was there, I don't know if she will remember that she was pretty small, maybe 3 years old. She might remember this. Angela, you might remember, I don't know. But you were sitting at a table, a little round table with Scotty, your cousin Scotty. And you were laughing, you and Scotty were laughing. You know, you're kids having a good time. But old Don, I call him an a-hole. I don't want to swear on this video to you, but you can imagine what I would call him, what my opinion on him was. And he yells at you two, "Shut up! Shut up!" Here you are at your grandma's house with your cousin, and you can't even laugh as kids would do because some a-hole on a couch wants you to shut up. You know, Angela, I grabbed you by the hand, and you and I walked out of Grandma's house, Grandma Pearl's house that day. And I never, ever brought you back. Because I'll be dang if I was going to bring you to a house to have some a-hole yell at you. I refused to ever bring you back to Grandma Pearl's. And you never went back to Grandma Pearl's until you were a teenager or older. At least I didn't bring her there. Now Maria's house, once in a while I might have you come to Maria's house. But I didn't want to have my daughters constantly coming to Maria's house all the time, and where Joey and David are throwing darts all over the place at the time because they were kids at the time. The point is, the reason you didn't see your dad very much was because I didn't have the proper facilities to bring you to, and that's the truth. But how did I feel about you during going through that? I want to be showing you some pictures. I want you to show you a picture right now, and this picture that you're going to see on the screen right now, because I'm going to put it up there. This is the place that's over on Grand Avenue. It's called the Safe House. Then there's another place I'm going to show you that was over at Marshall Avenue. It was across the street from the vocational school over there. It was called Guild Hall. Let me explain to something first before I put them up there. From the time I left the house in 1978 till up to 1987, I was on a whole mess of psych wards. And why was I on these psych wards? Because nuts? No. Depression, 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 depression. And why was I depressed? I couldn't stand to be away from my daughters. I couldn't stand to be away from my daughters. I couldn't stand to be away from my daughters. I was depressed. I was depressed. I was depressed. And I was depressed. And I was depressed and depressed and depressed all the way through the 80s because I couldn't stand to be away from my daughters. And that's the gospel truth. In fact, just a second. Just give me a second. There's something I forgot to do here. I forgot to bring my Bible here. want you to see this. I put my right hand on the Bible, and I swear before Almighty God that everything I'm saying here is the gospel truth. All the way through the 80s, I could not stand to be away from my daughters, and it created depression, depression, depression. One psych ward after another. When I worked for Minnie Gaskell, well, example, before I worked for Minnie Gaskell, down at Ramsey Hospital, 2 or 3 different hospital stays down there. And after that, when I worked at Minnie Gaskell, when I lived downtown Minneapolis, I ended up at the Fairview Hospital in out toward Midway. I ended up at another hospital downtown Minneapolis. I ended up in United Hospital. I think it was called United Hospital out west 7th Street. I ended up in another house that was way up Abbott Northwestern Hospital that was North Minneapolis. And there were a few hospitals, I can't remember them all. But one hospital ward after another. Depression, 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 depression. And why was I depressed? Because I couldn't stand to be away from my daughters. Now those pictures. You know, a lot of times when I'd be in these hospital wards for depression, when you get out of the hospital ward, you know, when your 30 days is up and they want to send you to some facility. Now I'm going to start showing you some pictures. One picture here I'm going to pull on the screen right now. It's called the Safe House. It's over on Grand Avenue. That's where they sent me. Oh, another hospital is St. Joseph's Hospital downtown. Yeah, I was in that psych ward too. I was in just about every hospital in St. Paul for depression at one time or another. But there I was. I was sent to the Safe House. And that was a safe house, and you're looking at it on your screen now. It's this big brown building, and that's where they would send people from psych wards. But it was short term. You could only stay there about 30 days. They sent you there, and you'd stay there 30 days until they figured out some other facility you went to. So there I was at this safe house, and until they figured out another facility I could be sent to because of depression. I wasn't working, so I was depressed. And the next building you're going to see was called Guild Hall, and that's where they sent me to. It was over at Guild Hall. It was across from a vocational school on Marshall Street. These were places where people from mental wards would go to. This is where I would spend some time. And even though I could only spend a month at the Safe House on Grand, once I left my apartment there and went to Guild Hall, I could keep coming back to the Safe House, which means you could hang out there all day. You could only live there for about a month in one of their apartments, but after that, you could keep coming there and visit every day. And so there I would sit there at the Safe House, that brown building you're sitting there, and I would sit there every day with coffee, drinking coffee. And guess what I was thinking? No, guess what I was feeling and thinking? Feeling and thinking. I can't stand to be separated from my daughters. From the time I got up tonight, I was thinking about my daughters. Till the time I got up, till the time I went to bed, I was thinking about my daughters. I never stopped thinking about my daughters. Not one day during the whole 80s decade. Not one day. 365 days from the time I got up each year to the time I went to bed, I thought about my daughters. 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 Constantly, constantly, each and every day. I once told Jerry this. He wouldn't believe me. I swear, and I put my hand on this Bible, I swear before Almighty God that every day I got up till the time I went to bed at night, I thought about my daughters. I thought about my daughters. I thought, and here's what I felt. I can't stand being separated from my daughters. I can't stand being away from my daughters. I can't stand being away from my daughters. I can't stand, and I swear this before an Almighty God who knows exactly what I went through those years. I'm not saying this because I want a response from any of you. I'm saying this because I want you to know what it was like for me. I wasn't out running all over the place and running with this person and that person, not caring about. If I did try to get in relationships with women, it was because I was trying to get into a decent place to live again so I could have my daughters, like when I was with Carol. And you know, when I was with that Carol, around 1979, 80, up till 82, and I used to bring my daughters to her place over in Crystal, Minnesota, that Carol was a very wonderful woman. In fact, I talked to her. I even talk to her to this day once in a while. And I'm going to tell you something. But I couldn't have a relationship with her. And you want to know why? Because the only thing I could think of all the time when I was with Carol back then, that first Carol back in around 1980, 1982, is I want to be with my daughters. All I could think of was Burr Street. I could not, stand the thought of having a relationship or marriage with Carol because all I could think about was my daughters on Burr Street. I wanted to go home to Burr Street. That's all I wanted, was just to be able to go home to my daughters on Burr Street. And that didn't stop all the way through the 80s. No, your dad may have not been there with you. No, you may not have seen your dad but every couple of years. But let me tell you, your dad was most likely sitting in some psych ward or some facility after a psych ward, depressed, sad, hurting, deeply hurting, deep inside, because he couldn't be with his daughters. I'm making this because I want my daughters to know what it's like for me all the way through the 80s. And then 1986 came along, and I was with Joanne. And yes, Angela, I brought Angela over to Joanne's, but then in August 6, 1986, Joanne drowned herself in the Mississippi River. And that put me back into the psych ward. Only this time, I'll be honest, I wasn't so much depressed about my daughters as I was the fact that my fiance had just drowned herself. And there I was on the psych ward. And actually, I was still depressed because I couldn't be with my daughters. It's just now, Joanne's death, my fiance drowning herself, was all stacked on top of that. Now, I'm on a psych ward. I'm not only depressed because I'm separated from my daughters, but I'm depressed because my fiance just committed suicide, and there I was. And the Dr. Balmer is what his name was, the psychiatrist there. He says, "Okay, Jeff," he says, "I'm going to help sign you up for Social Security." Now let me explain something to you. I knew that the minute I got on Social Security that I would never work anymore, that I would be on Social Security. And I had a conversation with your mom about that. There I am at the hospital, and from the hospital ward, I'm still on the hospital down at Ramsey Hospital. It's 1986, September, and the doctor's telling me he wants to put me on Social Security. And so I called your mom on the phone. And I'm calling her right from the hospital, and your mom and I are having a conversation, and I said, "What do you think, Marilyn? Should I go on Social Security or not?" I said, and your mom said, "Yes, go on Social Security." And you know why your mom said, "Yes, go on Social Security"? Because she knew once I went to Social Security would send child support payments. Not only would Social Security pay me a monthly check, but they would send her child support payments for you girls, because they would give you so much for your dependents, which is about equal to half of what they were sending me. And so your mother and I decided together. It was a mutual decision. It was not something that I decided on my own. Yeah, okay, I'll go get Social Security. But it was something your mom and I decided together. It was a mutual decision. So your mom decided for me to go on the Social Security just as much as I decided to. So it was our decision, not just mine alone, or the doctor's. And so I went on Social Security, and then from September till February, they never sent me nothing. And then in February, all of a sudden, my Social Security went through, and they sent me the 6 months back payment And when they sent me that 6-month back payment, that's when I set up the apartment on Arkwright Street, bought a car, and I sent your mom, I gave your mom a lot of that money, a good chunk of it, and I tried to give Jan some, but Jan wouldn't take it, which for Justin. But you see, what the deal was, welfare wanted me to give them the money. They wanted me to pay that back child support that they were still trying to get out of me from when they were supporting your mom for 3 years. I said, no way. I says, I'm giving the money to mother my kids. She needs it for them. And I just more or less gave them the finger. I mean, they were taking money out of my checks all them years and never giving your mom any of it, just giving it back to welfare because of when they took care of your mom for them 3 years. They never sent your mom any child support money that they took from me. And so when I got all that money, I saw to it that your mom got it and they didn't. And that's what happened. You know, one thing that used to bother me through the years is when your mom went back to work for the telephone company, you know, here's what your mom would always say. Oh, Jeff, I make all this money at the telephone company. I'm always supporting all this money I'm putting into raising our kids. Where's your money, Jeff? Why ain't you giving any? Girls, I just explained to you where my money was. I didn't have any money. And I didn't create that situation. It was your mom's choices that created that situation. When your mom went to work at the phone company, every dollar she got from her check came to Burr Street. She didn't have to pay some out here and pay some out there. She didn't have child support coming and taking half of her checks away. I did. And it was to pay back welfare for all the money that your mom and Jerry lived on for 2 or 3 years. So there you have it. Yes, I was in a financial situation where I couldn't put into Burr Street, which your mom was when she started working at the phone company, but I didn't create that situation. I didn't cause that situation. Your mom did. Now let's go back up to 1978, and again, what if she would have never filed divorce, and all that overtime I worked every week would have continued to come into Burr Street, continually, like your moms did. Then what would it have been like for you girls? What could I have done for my girls these days if that could have been the scenario? That I stayed on Burr Street and all my checks just kept coming into Burr Street, all them overtime hours that I'd work every week, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, all that overtime constantly coming into Burr Street. What if that would have continued to go on and on and on, like your mom's check from the phone companies kept going on and on and on? Imagine if your mom would have worked at the phone company and then on top of my 6 days a week and all my overtime. Imagine what we could have been doing for our daughters now. I knew that back then. That's what I wanted back then. I tried to run that past your mom back then. I sat in Burr Street in your living room on Burr Street right there, and I begged your mom not to get the divorce. I says, Marilyn, I says, the money that you and I can make together. And I went and I pleaded with her. I pleaded with her not to do this. But she did this anyway. She filed for divorce, and when she did, she condemned me to a life of poverty because I could never get off the floor after that, because every time I worked, they would keep coming after my checks to reimburse welfare for the money they paid your mom to live on those 3 years. Your mom said, well, I never asked no money or child support from you, Jeff. Well, no, it didn't matter. They were still, you know, they had given her several $1,000s in 3 years. And they were coming after me for every cent of it. They didn't come after your mom's check. When your mom started working for a telephone company, they didn't say, well, Marilyn, we supported you for 3 years, and now you're working at the telephone company. We're going to start guaranteeing you some of your checks now to reimburse us for when we paid you those 3 years. No, they kept that coming after me. They came after my checks to pay back welfare, not your mom's. Now, let's get back to my emotions. my emotions. I stayed at the safe house. Sometimes I would sit there all day long, and all I could think of was my girls. When I was at Guild Hall, all I could think of was my girls. It didn't matter where I was at. When I was staying in my, when I worked at Minigasco and I had that a small efficiency apartment downtown Minneapolis that Angela came to, I'd come home every night and I was all alone in that apartment, and all I could think is, I want to be with my girls. Every night I want to be with my girls. Every night I want to be with my girls. Every night I want to be with my girls. And remember those words when I hitchhiked out of Florida. I can't stand being separated from my girls. I can't stand being separated from my daughters. I can't stand being separated from my family. I can't stand being separated from my girls. If you want to know how the whole 80s decade, every day from the time I got up till the maybe several hundred times a day, I would be thinking and feeling I can't stand being separated from my girls. And the next day, from morning till night, or when I got up till the time I went to bed, all day long, I can't stand being separated from my girls. And the next day, I can't stand being separated from my girls. And the next day, I can't stand being separated from my girls. And when I talk to your mom and Jerry on the phone, one of the first things I would say is, I can't stand being separated from my girls. And Jerry's smart-ass mouth, oh, don't tell me you're thinking that all the time, Jeff. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking that all the time, mister. I can't stand being separated from my girls. I'm making this tape because that's what I want you to know, is that all the way through the 80s, I couldn't stand being separated from my girls. And I went from one psych ward to another, to one facility to another. Depression. I wasn't psychosis. I was sad. I was depressed. I was feeling bad, sad, hurting, hurt. I was emotionally hurting, constantly, non-stop emotionally hurting because I was separated from my girls. Constantly hurting, constantly in emotional pain, non-stop emotional pain, continually, because I couldn't stand being separated from my girls. You want to know what your dad was feeling like through the 80s? I'm giving it to you straight. And I'm putting my right hand on the Bible right now. And I swear before Almighty God that I'm speaking to you the gospel truth. The days that I was sat at the safe house thinking I can't stand being separated from my girls. The days that I spent at Guild Hall I can't stand being separated from girls. The loneliness I spent in my apartment downtown Minneapolis, I can't stand being separated from my girls. All the way through the 80s. All the way. And then come Arkwright Street. And the first thing I wanted to do, the first thing I did with all that Social Security money was set up an apartment close so my girls could come over. And then after that, it's like you guys weren't coming over, and I said, Marilyn, I said, why aren't the girls coming over more often? She says, well, you need a house, you live in some apartment down there, and they're used to being in a home and a house. So I go and I rent a half a house over on Bradley Street, and you guys know the history. I've brought that up to you too many times. And I lived there from approximately October 1990 till about August 1991, not quite a year, about 10 months. And in that 10 months, I was only a block away from Burr Street. I set up a house thinking my girls could just walk over there anytime they want to see their dad. So they could see their dad on a daily basis anytime they want to, just like they did their mom, 1 block away from your house on Burr Street. And in 10 months, every one of you only came over there one time in 10 months. And I only lived a block away from you. One time in 10 months. And after, I was paying pretty good money out to rent that house. You didn't rent out houses cheap back then, and it ain't like I was making mega bucks. I worked in a warehouse, and it cost me pretty good rent to rent out that house. Finally, I thought, well, I'm paying out all this money. My girls ain't coming over anyway, so what's the point of paying out all this money to rent this house? My girls ain't coming. And so I gave up the house and I moved downtown Minneapolis. You see, that's how it went down. And and it hasn't gotten any better. But even then, I still stayed single. You know why I stayed single all them years? You know why I stayed? I may have had relationships with women, but I never got married. And I don't know why I didn't get married all the way through the 90s. You want to know why? Because I wanted my apartment to always be available to my girls anytime they would come over. I didn't want to have some woman in the house saying, oh, this is my house now, and I don't know if your daughter should be here this weekend. I would not let that happen. So I stayed single. And every apartment I had, I stayed single, even downtown Minneapolis in the end. And I would sit there all the way through the 90s now. This is we're out of the 80s, we're into the 90s. And I would sit there. My daughters were adults by this time with their own families, as a matter of fact. And I would sit there by the phone. There'd be a phone there, and I would just sit there by the phone. I smoked in those days, and I'd sit there with my coffee and cigarettes, and I'd smoke sitting by that phone, waiting for that phone to ring. Just waiting for that phone to ring. Hoping that maybe someday that phone would ring. It would be one of my daughters saying, we want to come over and see you, Dad. And those several years, I lived there. About 5 years, downtown Minneapolis. In them 5 years, I think my daughters came over once in 5 years. One time in 5 years. So you see, when you look at it, my viewpoint, yeah, look at it from my viewpoint. And one thing your mom told me when you girls were little girls, and I don't know which one of you it was, she says, your daughter's praying for you to quit smoking. I don't know which one of you was praying for me to quit smoking, but I want you to know that your prayers finally got through, because I haven't smoked in 10 years. I haven't smoked since March 2006, nor have I desired to smoke. I mean, the Lord miraculously delivered me from smoking, and I haven't even desired to smoke since March 2006. I just wanted to say that. But I want you to know something. I'm not making this video because I want a response from you. I want you to know what I went through during the 80s. I want you to know what it was like for me being separated from my daughters. And I want you to know that it was not my will to be separated from my daughters. It hurt real bad. Every day. All day. Each and every day. Not one day went past during the whole day, a whole 1980s decade, that I didn't hurt inside. Because, it got a little better maybe in 1987 when I got the apartment on Arkwright. I saw my daughters a little bit more. But it still was not near as much as I wanted to. And I'm going to end this video now, because I pretty much said what I wanted to say. One hospital ward to the next for depression, and all because I couldn't be with my daughters. That's what the 1980 was like for me. Depression, 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 depression. Let me define depression another way. Sadness, 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 deep sadness, hurting sadness, down in my gut sadness. I can't stand this sadness. I can't stand being separated from my daughters. I can't stand being separated from my daughters. That was my emotions. That was my feelings. That's what I thought each and every day, all day long. No, that's not what I thought. That's what I felt each day, all day long. Sadness, sadness, sadness. You can put a nice name on it, sugarcoat it with the word depression, depression, depression. But let me tell you what depression is. It's sadness. It's sadness. It's sadness. It's sadness. It's feeling sadness. It's feeling sadness. It's feeling deep sadness. It's feeling terrible. It's feeling hurting. It's hurting sadness. From the time I got up till the time I went to bed, I hurt. I hurt. I hurt. I hurt. I hurt. I hurt. And I hurt. And I hurt. All the way through the 80s. Because I couldn't stand being separated from my daughters. And I hope you finally get the point. I hope you understand this message. And I put my right hand on the Bible, and I swear before Almighty God that everything I've said to you on this video is the gospel truth. Amen.